From the heart of the Low Country in South Carolina,
it's the Take Two podcast, where we take theology to the next level. All right, well, welcome back to Take Two. This is our Thursday edition where we talk about crazy things. No, I'm just...
it just seems that way for the last couple here.
Yeah, we've had a couple questions about some of Heiser's work. So that was our last Thursday edition. And we wanted to continue on kind of talking about something related to the unseen realm, was this idea of the...
Oh, this is where it gets tricky. Is it the... I even say it wrong all the time. I'm going to try to say the Nephilim. That's how he says it, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Heiser says Nephilim. And I thought there was an E at the end of it, because you remember at the very end we were talking about pronunciation, and I guess I was spelling it wrong because I thought it was like I-E-M at the end, but it's not spelled that way. So you'll see it in our title spelled the right way. But I grew up hearing people call them the Nephilim.
Yeah, it's one of those things where I don't know why I didn't hear about it more. It's one of those things that if you're starting to read through the Bible, you're hitting this like day two. Like, it comes up a lot. I didn't grow up like talking a lot about this. I was a little familiar with it. And then you look online and there's a lot of info, whether it's tied to scripture or goes off the rails. It's a topic that people want to hear about.
Yeah, and there are, it's kind of like we were talking about last episode, there are scriptures that give support to some of what we're going to say, but it's not like this is the purpose of scripture.
Right.
It wasn't the purpose of scripture to explain everything about angels or everything about the unseen realm, because if it was, we'd have more information there, but we don't. But it's not like it's not there. So there are things there. Yeah,
it's like it's important enough to be aware of and know what scripture says, but you can run off so fast. And so I think that's a great way to frame it. It's not something to be like someone. Well, depending on what it is, not something to be super divisive over, depending on how crazy it is.
Right.
But we'll talk about different common views that are perfectly acceptable. And it's really not something to spend, countless hours on too. That's the temptation, I think.
Yeah.
Because it's so uncertain. You want to know everything. That can be a challenge.
Yeah. And I'm trying to hold back this comment, but I'm going to make it anyway.
Do it. Don't Michael Mott, unfiltered and raw.
I love Lord of the Rings.
Never mind. Hold it back. No, go on.
And other, fantasy type things. And I've asked myself, like, Michael, why are you pulled to these things? And I think it's because I'm drawn to this power, like this cool things. But, the elves in the Lord of the Rings are like this immortal race, and they have some type of, power over. And I think deep down inside of us, Zach, you may not have it, but
I'm deficient.
Inside most of us, there's the desire to be like God, to have those, those attributes of God that we don't have right now. And I think maybe that plays into some of the interest in this subject, because it's like we're going to look at potentially, where the flesh, crossed over with the spirit world, and you see different stuff like the TV series Paranormal, and then all the horror movies like Exorcist, which I stay away from, because I think most people can watch that stuff and they just go ha 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 ha. I'm like
too real.
That's that is too real.
Don't mess around.
Yeah. So I think that may play into some of it, because we have a desire to kind of exercise those those powers and stuff,
and we're not totally physical. It's there's something there that whatever degree it is, whether you have are compelled to read Lord of the Rings or not, I agree that all of us have that in us a little bit, and that's intriguing.
And it could be like Marvel,
and that's right,
superheroes,
different ways,
different ways that people we like superheroes because they demonstrate things that we don't have.
So maybe we can start off talking about, I don't know if I put this in all of our notes, but I was going to talk about pronunciation. We kind of hit that.
Yeah.
Even like etymology, translational use, because I think that's interesting to kind of to frame it. Like, what's this word mean? Because really it's a Hebrew transliteration in a way. And literally in Hebrew, I think it means the fallen or fallen ones. It doesn't really specify human, spirit, but that's the gist. And if you were to read the King James Version, I think that's going to say giants, not Nephilim. Nephilim.
Okay.
I don't know. I know for sure the Septuagint uses giants. I want to say the King James does, but I guess I should have fact-checked that too. But I think that kind of frames it. There's even a little bit of disagreement when you look at different translations. I think ESV will say, Nephilim, footnote, or giants to kind of throw in these different things to think about. Well, with all that said, Michael, can you read for us the text in question? It's Genesis 6, 1 through 4.
Yeah, so here we go. It says, when man began to multiply on the face of the land, and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterwards, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men of old, the men of renown.
I think what comes to my mind, I wrote down some notes here, like just some initial observations, things we can be thinking about even before we get into some of the major views. But what's going on in Genesis if we zoom out big picture? You look at beginning of Genesis, creation, you have the fall, and then really Scripture goes to great lengths to say things were not super good, that there was sin, continually evil. And we see that, later on the Tower of Babel, really until we get a glimpse of Abraham and that kind of thing. We get a little bit of that here in Noah later on, but this comes immediately before Noah and the flood, about how after the fall things are not going so great.
Right. And I'll also mention just before this, we have some very odd, or at least odd to our modern day, I think, genealogies. And it's like, this is the father of all those who make music and stuff like that. Like,
it's kind of weird.
What is going like it? So I think that whoever wrote that down, Moses, or if it was oral tradition passed down to Moses and he wrote it down, I have to think that it was meaningful to them.
Yep.
And I think that somehow through time and culture differences that we've lost it, because I feel like there's more there that we're probably missing. But I read it and I go, Lord, if you want, me to, here's some people. That's great.
I don't today or whatever it's saying.
I don't understand necessarily everything going on here, but you got it down here, so I want to read it and open my eyes to it. But so that immediately precedes this.
That is unusual.
Which kind of plays into some of the interpretations of what this might be talking about, which we'll get to in a little bit.
I think you nailed it. A couple other things briefly. I think it's interesting in verse 1 talks about when man began to multiply. It's like shades of be fruitful and multiply. So that's like a good thing, but then it goes off the rails. You see this language of these people took what they chose. It kind of, your eyes see something, the fruit in the garden. You see this, we'll talk about it later. It says, and the Nephilim here now, and then afterwards. So what's that mean after the flood? Yeah. A lot of things that come swirling in my mind, and I'll go ahead and read this Numbers passage, because you really I think you only see this specific word twice in Scripture, like this.
And it's good to point out that what I just read is pre-flood.
Yes.
And what you're about to read is post-flood, which also should play into our understanding of what these people possibly could be.
That's exactly right. And the other thing I think that's great to think about are, maybe we'll get into this. I'll read this Numbers 13 passage starting in verse 28. It says, however, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large. And besides, we saw the descendants of Anak there. The Amalekites dwell in the land of the Negeb. The Hittites, the Jebusites, and the Amorites dwell in the hill country. And the Canaanites dwell by the sea and along the Jordan. And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. So what's going on here in Numbers? What's going on with Israel?
So they're marching around out in the desert. They've recently been saved from Egypt. And they've had some missteps, but not the huge misstep that they're about to have. And so Moses sends in these 12 spies, and they come back with the bad report. And this is part of their bad report, and they're scared. Like they see these Nephilim, or as we might see Nephilim. But I think you're right that that calls them giants in the land.
In like KJV or other, and so that's where people, because some people say, hey, size, physical stature's not a thing. This is kind of where they're like, well, if you seem like grasshopper, some people say it's hyperbole, right. Or some people are like, no, all these things. But it is interesting, and even thinking about, okay, I think behind the scenes, like Moses is writing both of these accounts, so is there some sort of teaching thing in there as well, connecting the dots? But anyway, the only other text where that is specified specifically, you can look at places like Deuteronomy 3:11. It talks about King Og and this iron bed that was like 14 feet or something.
Right.
We read a lot about these Rephaim. I don't remember exactly how to say it. But they kind of make this connections of descendants, and some would even point to someone like Goliath and say,
because he spoke of as a giant, and he has brothers that are killed later on. That's mentioned in 2 Samuel, and I think it's not very clear. There's like a textual variant between 2 Samuel and 2 Chronicles, where one of them looks like this guy, a different guy than David, kills Goliath, but then it's like, no, this guy killed a brother of Goliath. But there are these other giants there, and so maybe they're part of this Nephilim as well.
Because is this? I might be wrong on this, but this is almost if Goliath is part of this. I think there's somewhere that from the descendants of Gath and Rapha, and people kind of connect them. That after Goliath killed his brothers, that's kind of like an ending point in Scripture.
Yeah, I don't
know,
and maybe I'm not aware of another one.
Yeah.
So if you are aware of another mention of them,
please do.
Yeah, comment, let us know, and we'll look it up.
Well, to me, there are 3 traditional views. We'll run through them briefly. I can kick off this first one here, where really these 3 views try to iron out who are the sons of God and who are the daughters of men. That help give us some insight to the Nephilim,
right.
Figuring that out.
Because that first passage in Genesis 6 seems to say that that's how he got them.
Yes.
So if they came from this, well, let's figure out who the sons of God are and the daughters of men are.
So in this first view would pose that the sons of God are actually Sethites, people who came from the line of Seth, this godly line. And the daughters of men, by contrast, are Cainites, come from the line of Cain. And this view kind of takes out the supernatural in a way that there's not angels, they're not demons. The children of this union are human. The Nephilim are not supernatural beings. Essentially, this is believers and non-believers. Right. And really, what they look at is this genealogy a lot that proceeds in Genesis 5. They look at Cain's genealogy, Seth's genealogy. You read in the New Testament that Adam was a son of God. Use that language in Luke or Matthew or wherever we see that. And so if Adam is a son of God and Seth's walking in that, maybe we can see that is what some people would look at, that Sethites can be considered sons of God in that sense. A couple things with that genealogy that's interesting is both in Seth's line and in Cain's line, you have Lamech.
Yeah.
Lamech is not a good guy. No. He's extra bad, 77, avenged, however the phrase is.
Yeah, he's comparing himself to Cain. Like, how bad Cain was. Yeah.
I'm worse than that. And then you have Lamech on Seth's line, who is the father of Noah, who kind of, he says, we got some relief coming to us through Noah. You also have Enoch. We're very familiar with Enoch and Seth's line, walked with God and then was no more.
Right.
You have Enoch on Cain's side. Methuselah. So there's like these parallels and these connections. And so some people are like, this is very intentional leading up to this. We've got one line and the other line, and they're different, and they came together. And what I was looking at, proponents of this view would be people really, you look in church history, maybe like the 300s onward, it became more popular. I was looking at like Augustine held this view. A lot of people point back to him because everyone loves Augustine, that kind of thing. And so I think that kind of paints a picture, just, simply. So I think people like that. It's just humans, nothing major to see here. What's the big deal?
Right.
Anything you would add to that first view?
Well, yeah. So I don't know if you're going to talk about the pros and cons for each one. I think a pro of this is it makes sense. It is, humans with humans, and so that's a defined process. And the thing that doesn't make sense, I think, is probably where this one and probably the next one fall short is it doesn't really make sense of how we get them back again in numbers, because we have everyone on the earth, every person on the earth killed except for Noah, his wife, his 3 sons, and their 3 wives. So if there was something that was wrong or bad about the lineage of Seth, marrying into the lineage of the Canaanites, then how did we get that back? And then it also doesn't address, like, well, what if a male of Cain married a female of Seth? So, yeah,
I think it's lacking, and I think people point to it because it's not supernatural, which are kind of like, bro. Yeah. There's a lot of supernatural that's happening right here. Like, come on, like this, you can't have a hang up with this, right?
Right. Yeah. So, you want to talk about the next one?
Jump ahead.
Yeah. So the next one, and maybe you can fill out some of this one, because when I listen to this one, like, this is I think the least likely of them, because I think it just lacks explanatory power. But in this one, the sons of God are potentially the tyrannical heroes or human kings from the line of Lamech, which we were just talking about. And then they're marrying, again, I think the daughters of men. So you want to flesh that out for us?
I was looking stuff up on this, and I think the take was, sons of God. That's a term in ancient Near Eastern literature that can point to, semi-divine beings. Maybe a king is a son of God in a way, a men of renown. And maybe it was something like a warlord, or, someone who has this big harem of women, or they go from town to town and they take peasants from all over, and they can take, any woman they desire because they're conquering cities. And some of these proponents would point to, things like I looked up 2 Samuel 7:13, where King Solomon is referred to be like a son of God. And so they would say, oh, well, you see kings are sons of God, that this could be that. And so really these sons of God, these kings are who intermarried with humans. And so if that's the case, similar thing, right. The Nephilim would be humans, not supernatural. And a lot of these proponents would say, hey, here it doesn't even talk about giants necessarily. It might be talking about renown, military might. Right. It's more of a reputation more than physical stature. Right.
But does that make sense of a 14-foot bed?
So that yeah, maybe it makes sense in Genesis 6.
Or
but
a
maybe
spear
not.
that's like a weaver's beam for Goliath. Yeah.
And I think people who take to this feel like this term Nephilim meant something specific here, but maybe it's an elastic term. It might not mean the exact same thing, or I don't know where they try to argue, because I think that is the challenge, is that, okay, there are things that are not normal going on with some of these, with other people here.
Like I said, on the podcast I listened to, I found this one to be the least compelling, and one of my daughters was asking me about this. I was like, well, there's 3 views. Here's one, here's the other. And honestly, I barely remember the other one because I just found it. I found it not compelling at all to me.
And I think some would say, some people that might want to take a middle ground might say, hey, these sons of God, these warlords, or, people of great military conquest, they were demon possessed. Maybe they'd be like, hey, they have demonic influence that's making them so powerful, but they're like, I feel like they're almost hedging their bets, like they don't want to commit. You know what I mean?
Right.
But so some would say that, some wouldn't say that. Right. But I was seeing that, which leads us to the most supernatural view, the last view that really looks at the sons of God as these fallen spiritual beings and daughters of men, these human women. and we talked a lot about this verbiage, sons of God,
Right.
and what that could mean.
Right.
We see in the Psalms it could, mean angelic beings. We see this in Job. The term, by contrast, it's not used a ton, but where it is, there's precedence for this. You see a lot of times Elohim, God used, but sometimes this phrase, son or sons of God, is a little bit less rare. Maybe
Right.
I was looking at maybe like 5 times in the Old Testament. And so these sons of gods are fallen spiritual beings that are taking daughters of men, and this is where the Nephilim come from. Anything you would add to that, Michael?
I would say, so if we're evaluating these, I
Yes.
think this has the best explanatory power. The hiccup that probably I and others have is this idea of how does a spiritual being,
Right.
how does that, with a woman, how does that all work? Obviously angels are spiritual beings. You say, but no, wait, Michael, Abraham saw the angel of the Lord with 2 other angels when they came to talk, and, Sarah laughed. And of course, angels can make themselves visible, obviously, because there's visions. But, there's just a question of when they make themselves visible, do they have DNA? Do they have
right.
something, do they have chromosomes? Has God given them the ability to, make a gamete that could, serve to be, half of the thing that, fertilizes the egg? Sorry, I couldn't think of the word I was thinking of. So I think that's the difficulty, is like how, if this happens,
Yeah.
God must have allowed them to do this, which is fine. God can allow them to do whatever, but it just seems like a very odd thing. But it seems like it probably is the best explanation for what's going on. But it's
Kind of
just
makes
like,
the most sense reading the text.
Yeah.
Anyway, you're not like, it's very weird language, and I think some people point to, well, Jesus says that angels aren't, they don't marry, and you'd be like, well, that's in heaven, and that's different than what is
Right.
happening. This is different.
right, those are unfallen angels, and those are angels who have kept to do what they're supposed to do, and these are clearly fallen angels who, if this is what the case is, are outside the bounds of what God intended for them to do.
And it does seem, I mean, we don't get enough information here, but you look towards the New Testament, and it seems like there's an awareness of this kind of stuff. There's, citing of the book of First Enoch and the book of Jubilees and this kind of thing, which, I would say we don't put all of our hope and faith in the book of Enoch.
Right.
I think it's telling that, maybe Peter and Jude are talking about it a little bit.
Sure, yeah. Should we read those passages?
I think that would be great if you want to pull those up.
Now, you have this from the ESV.
Oh, I keep doing that. That's like my go-to. Yeah,
That's fine. And for most passages, I wouldn't face me. But back a long time ago, when I was the youth leader, we memorized all of the book of Jude out of the NASB.
So it's like, this is like,
yeah,
doesn't make sense.
Right,
you're like, come on.
Right. So how about I read the Peter one, and then you read the Jude one, so that
Great. So you don't have to, I love it.
Yeah, so this is 2 Peter 2:4, and it says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment," and obviously there's more, but that's the part we're looking for, is that these angels sinned and they got, a special judgment. Like, we know that these other angels, we've read the book of Revelation. We know kind of how things end, but it seems like there's this group of angels that for some reason get this special, earlier than normal judgment. And then I think Jude maybe gives us a little more.
One more thought on 2 Peter. In the midst, in the context here, what is helpful is that Peter, his example, he looks to Noah, and then he looks at Sodom and Gomorrah. Like, it's like right in this Genesis time frame. It's not like this is pulled apart separately.
Right.
So it's like, okay, he's talking about angels that are, or these angelic angels that are in Genesis specifically. So that gives us some insight. Okay, this is probably what he's talking about. And then in Jude, verses 6 through 7, Jude writes, "And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he is kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. Again, what I find is interesting, Jude makes that same, he kind of brings in Sodom and Gomorrah too.
Right.
It's like they're all, and probably because they're both alluding to the book of First Enoch too.
Right.
It's like, they're making these connections though,
Right.
that I think are significant.
Yeah, and there's a comparison here, like the angels didn't stay within their own position, and look, Sodom and Gomorrah, those people didn't, stay within the bounds, and it was, both of those were sexual in nature, so they trespassed these sexual bounds, and so it kind of gives more supporting evidence that maybe this is what's going on, and maybe that's why these angels got separated for early special punishment, because man, they really stepped outside of God's plan, and what they did would have been something that God allowed them to do within their nature, but it was really forbidden. And it wasn't like God didn't foresee this happening, right? He's omniscient, he's in control, so he allowed this for some purpose, but it was really beyond the nature of what was supposed to be. And so these angels that did it would have gotten some immediate type of punishment ahead of the end of the age.
Yeah, it's clearly pointing to some event, and then I'm going to read 1 Peter 3:19 through 20. It's a little bit less clear, but it talks about Noah,
Sure.
and Peter writes, in which he went and proclaimed, talking about Jesus Christ, and proclaimed to the spirits in prison. That's kind of the connection there, because they formerly did not obey when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water. It's a little bit less clear, but it's an ambiguous text that there's been a lot of discussion on. What did Jesus do when he proclaimed to the spirits in prison? It's tied to Noah's day. That's helpful.
Right.
But another biblical passage that at least alludes back briefly.
Yeah, and it's because other passages that mention Jesus leading captivity captive, and I think it's clear that part of what's going on here is like, when we read the story of Lazarus and the rich man, and Lazarus is in the bosom of Abraham, and there's this chasm that after the, during his time that he was in the tomb, that he is basically taking Abraham's bosom, which was so-called paradise, but bringing them, to be in a more fuller relationship with him. But then you have passages like this that maybe say that there are other things going on here, that we don't get a lot of details on, but maybe a part of some of this. Yeah.
And one thing, just to way back up, I will say I put this in our notes as option 3.5. There's another view I came across.
Let's hear it.
That it basically is this last view, but they say that the Nephilim are not offspring of this union. It just happens at the same time. If you read the text, it doesn't directly make that comparison. Although if you're reading it logically, it follows. It says, sons of God, daughters of men. And they're like, in those days, Nephilim existed.
Sure.
And so they're trying to separate some of that union, but saying it just trying to provide some context for the time period it happened in.
Yeah, so that what they're saying is that we're committing the post hoc prompter hoc fallacy, which is basically that this A or B followed A, so that we assume A caused B, but that's not always the case.
It's not at that explicit in the text. We just kind of connect those dots. A couple things I wanted to mention. I alluded to it, but if you look, and I don't think this is the end all be all, but I think it helps us think about it. Church history, if you look at the views throughout history, just a broad survey, it seems like the prominent view was, sons of God as these fallen demonic beings until about the 4th century. So if you look at people like Justin Martyr or Irenaeus or Tertullian, they all affirm this. Then once you hit about Augustine, Athanasius, that time frame, they both say, oh no, this is more Sethites and Canaanites. It's just that's kind of the shift. And then if you look at Jewish history, it seems like what we're talking about as the preferred view, is the prominent view until around the 100s. And Danny mentioned some of this too, maybe trying to distance themselves from Christianity, not the supernatural stuff. They kind of flipped their script a little bit more, maybe in the 200s. So a little bit earlier on, it kind of shifted. But if you read a lot of that literature, it kind of points to this, obviously.
And I was listening, you were asking earlier if there are any other mentions of the Nephilim in the Bible that I was aware of, and I don't know of any. But I was listening to a podcast, and I don't know if Heiser, I about did it. I about did it. I about said Heiser. I don't know if Heiser says this, but I was listening to a podcast between another guy who had his doctorate. I don't remember his name, but he was being hosted. So, and they were clearly talking about Heiser's material, but they suggest that some of the myths surrounding like Greek mythology, like Hercules and others, like these guys who were half human, half gods, and they were able to carry out these feats that we would say, oh, that's just mythology. That was just being, ramped up and there's a word for that. I can't think
ramped
of.
Up sounds great.
Ramped up. That's the formal. Well, I guess mythologized. That become legendary. But they're suggesting that maybe that wasn't what happened. Maybe there were these Nephilim that weren't necessarily, with Philista, with the Jews. Maybe there were some in Greece, and they were doing, so that kind of gives weight to some of what they were worshiping back then.
Yeah, that's a good point too, because I've run across, I think a lot of Christians are familiar with the, Epic at Gilgamesh or these other flood accounts, and there's a lot of this literature that it's almost as if Genesis 6 is written as a response to, hey, maybe there are some, Nephilim or some of these, demigods or, whatever it is, but Yahweh, it's almost like a response to that being like, this is the real account and Yahweh is above them. He actually, punishes them or, whatever. But I've heard that people explain some of that too. A couple other things, I didn't hit it at the top, but in this text, I'm just going to kind of put you on the spot here.
Okay.
In verse 3, Moses writes, and the Lord said, my spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. For his days shall be 120 years. And I didn't crunch the numbers, but it seems like, people lived longer than 120 years right after that.
Right.
So is this like looking forward, or I've heard some people say, hey, this is a ticking time bomb. The flood's going to be in 120 years.
Oh.
I've heard that, I don't know if you have something specific there to that reference.
Yeah, I have taken that to mean that in some way, and I've heard, there's obviously lots of different theories on this. We can't expound them all.
Sure.
So, but I guess I have taken that to be, there's got to be some explanation as to why Methuselah is 969. I think Adam is like 870 or something like that. And then we see this sharp decline to, by the time we're cruising into Abraham, 80, 90 years, 100, I think Moses like 120. That was pretty old for back then, because he really didn't get started with the Exodus until like 80. So, so I've always just taken it to be that somehow men had longer life back then, and God withdrew whatever that grace was that was allowing to live, and so now our days are numbered around 120.
That seems to make sense. And you look, and that's like the general rule. It might not be exact, but it's like you look,
So, I mean, if I don't get 120, I'm going to be like,
come on,
what happened?
What happened? Maybe it's all
you didn't exercise enough.
our choices in fast food and all that, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, I think that helps us get kind of a broad view. Maybe it's a good time to shift to this term, cosmic geography.
Ooh,
That's a big one.
Yeah. So, and I don't, again, neither one of us are what we would call Heiserites. So I've not, maybe he explains this, but this term is used a lot, cosmic geography. And what I think, from my exposure to it, I'm like, why did we name it cosmic geography? Why didn't we name it spiritual geography or geography on earth with spiritual importance? But we were just talking in our last podcast about this title deed to earth that Jesus gets. And, somehow, Satan kind of owned the keys, but, then his death, burial, resurrection, he gets that back from him. And now he's, and I think, your Amil would say, well, Satan's bound now, but I don't know if that's the case, but there seems like there's some stuff going on there. With Moses' burial, I was always raised like, well, Moses was such a great prophet that had his, bones been buried where the people could find them, then they would worship him. And I guess that maybe is fine, but Moses was hated a lot during his ministry as well. But maybe by the time they spent that 40 years in there, they came to recognize, okay, this is God's true prophet. And then also this idea of Daniel 7, where you have the king of Persia who's warring against, and Michael has to one of them has to come help so that this angel can come deliver this message to answer Daniel's prayer.
That is interesting. It's like tied to
right. Yeah. And then there's this passage that we read, I think last time we were talking about this topic, where it seemed like maybe there were 70 different provinces. I think this was in Psalms, but maybe you remember better than me.
I got this passage here. This is not necessarily maybe about that, but in Deuteronomy 32, this is the Song of Moses. There is this reference, when the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance. When he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. Almost as if these different sons of God got this jurisdiction from a geographical perspective, like the Prince of Persia or whatever, is what it seems like it could mean. We get that from the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's not in the Textus Receptus. It's actually, that says sons of Israel or something. So it's kind of something that people look at and they're like, oh, this is a textual variant that maybe holds some credibility, because we kind of see that a little bit. And then we look in First Peter, they left their own, or Jude left their own position of authority. Maybe, I mean, it's a stretch to say for certainty, but maybe they were given authority in these different spheres geographically. And I think Heiser will point to, I don't know the passage, but Dagon, this false god, and in the presence of the ark, it's tipped over, and like their priests won't even walk over that threshold because that's been conquered by Yahweh or something like that, because they're scared. And Yahweh has jurisdiction now of that specific area because the ark is there. So I don't know.
Yeah, and this podcast I was listening to that was kind of talking about this. They talk about where Abraham offered up Isaac, and then you have Mount Sinai, which some people have said it may be one of these places that has some spiritual things, and then I've heard people say, and I don't know, I couldn't say this, but that where Abraham offered Isaac is where Jesus was ultimately sacrificed, that same location. And then we know that Jerusalem was, destroyed and buried, and then a pagan idol, a temple was put over that spot. And it's they're trying to... And I think it's cool. Maybe that's true. I wouldn't want to preach this on a Sunday morning because you just don't have enough to really substantiate it. That may be what's going on here. If that's going on, that kind of gives us some insight into the supernatural inner workings. I don't know the application to that. I don't know. Maybe there's an application that I'm missing. But where do we go from that? Maybe you got more.
I really don't. I think it's very interesting and intriguing, but it's hard to hang your hat and say, man, this is how it happened. In the same way that I might point to the flood and say, hey, I know the flood happened, and it's a little bit different, which leads us into this question about multiple falls in the spiritual realm. Great question from, was it Ferdinand Ramos? I'm not great at saying
right.
So
I think that's that. So this came through. So we can say now that this podcast is available on every platform that I'm aware of that carries podcasts. So if there's one out there that you're like, man, I have to listen to this on Spotify because it's not on my platform of choice, let us know. But
now you can.
To include YouTube, they're starting to have a podcast thing. So ours is listed as a podcast on YouTube. But we got a question on our last Thursday video, and it was what was our take on, could there be multiple falls of angels? And I think Heiser would say definitely yes, there could be. I don't know that we have enough information. I've always taken and was taught that this passage in Revelation that talks about the dragon taking out a third of the stars and then falling to the earth, that is, talking about when Satan fell. And again, this is supposition, but my upbringing was there were three archangels, Lucifer, Gabriel, and Michael. and kind of each one of them had a third of the angels in their charge. And when Satan fell, his third fell with him. I even looking back, like there's not a lot of scripture that would
support that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you're right where it's like, I have a hard time saying, there were 7 falls. I know exactly which one and how. And you read some of this, ancient apocalyptic Jewish literature, they might allude to stuff. It's just like, I'm not willing to say I know for a fact. Right. So I almost hate that because it's a boring answer, but I just can't go farther than that.
Right. And I know that some have, again, supposed, this is supposition, that when the angels who didn't fall chose not to fall, that somewhat solidified their nature.
It was like a probationary period, and it's like they're good.
Right. Now that they're in this state where they're not able to sin, like when we get a resurrection bodies, we're told we're going to be in a state that we can't sin. And so maybe when they resisted the urge to fall, then they kind of gained that immutability, at least in that sense, they're not going to sin. So I know that there are some theologians who believe that. So we're just not told whether a good angel today could decide to fall or not. But I know Heiser has at least dealt with the question, and it's a good question.
And I think he's probably looking at all these ancient Near East sources, and he's like, it seems like it is. But great question. Is things we don't think about all the time. I know we're running in our final moments here. So what do we do with this? This is something that if someone doesn't agree with, if someone takes one of these 3 views and I don't like it, I say, hey, I'm not going to church with you anymore.
Well, I would say this is definitely on the lowest tier of doctrines that we shouldn't divide over or get, you don't believe that the Nephilim are this. I think that there might be some things going on, like, the psalm that says, I lift my eyes up, where does my help come from?
Oh yeah.
I lift my eyes up to the hills. And I've heard this explained more than one way, but I think what makes sense to me is that, on these high places is where they had all of these Ashtoreth poles and these altars to Baal and stuff. And so maybe there's stuff going on that in our Western eyes and just being, time and culture separated from what's being written that we're not picking up on. But even though that stuff is there, I think the main point of that is still my help comes from the Lord. Whether someone's looking up to Jerusalem and saying, that, or they're looking up to these false idols and saying that, the main part of that verse is my help comes from the Lord.
I like that a lot. And when I evaluate my life, I want to be known for not my view on the Nephilim either. I think it's important to maybe, think about that, consider scripture, but it's like, man, I'm reminded of Paul talking about people devoting themselves to myths and endless genealogies. It's like, man, major on the major things, minor on the minor things, give it that perspective. And I think that's a great example, like, help comes from God. That's where we know this for a fact. Let's spend our time living in that reality and not neglecting this totally.
Sure. Yeah.
But not making it like this is the only thing we talk about all the time. I think it's fine to be interested. Not want to discourage people from learning more about it.
And God put it in the Bible.
Yep, exactly.
So we should talk about it, but like you said, it's not the major part of the Bible. Yeah. Yep.
Well, that's my take. That's I just made fun of Michael. Well, he said on one podcast, it's my take. He's like, I should have said our take. So that was payback. But
that's good. That's good.
That's our take.
That is our take. All right. Have a good one.
Thanks for listening to Take 2. Find us wherever you find podcasts and on YouTube for those who want to watch our videocast.